Your colonel title means nothing on these streets. Step out of the car. Tonight, I am the law. My brother-in-law slammed his open palm onto the hood of my SUV and roared into the freezing night air. He shined his high-beam tactical flashlight straight into my eyes, a despicable, arrogant smirk twisting his lips. Just hours earlier, I had served this man dinner. Now he stood on a desolate stretch of interstate, hiding behind his local police badge, fabricating a drunk driving charge against a Marine Corps colonel because I refused to hand him a career he never earned. But the most agonizing stab came from my own biological sister screaming through my phone the very next day. By suing my husband, you are tearing this family apart. She chose a corrupt cop over her own flesh and blood. Matthew believed his shiny little badge made him untouchable against family. But as I silently stepped out of that car, pressing the record button on my phone with an ice-cold stare, he had absolutely no idea that those 3 minutes of arrogance were about to cost him a $50,000 verdict and the most humiliating end to his pathetic career. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story resonates with you. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. The blinding glare of his police flashlight did not just hurt my eyes on that freezing highway. It violently dragged me back to the exact roots of his toxic jealousy, back to the day I first understood that in my family I existed only as a bank account with a heartbeat. When I was 19, I stood in the cramped living room of our childhood home clutching my first military commendation letter. I had just survived the most brutal weeks of Marine Corps boot camp. My hands were calloused, my boots were scuffed, and I carried physical and mental scars that I thought would finally earn me a shred of respect in my own house. My mother took the official certificate from my hands, glanced at the federal seal for exactly 2 seconds, and handed it back without a word. She immediately turned her back to me, her attention shifting entirely to my sister Sarah, who was lounging on the sofa filing her nails. "You deserve the best, sweetie," my mother purred, handing Sarah a heavy check for her college tuition. I knew where that money came from. I had filled out the money order myself at the PX counter back on base, the ink smudging under my sweating palms, sending every spare dollar from my meager enlistment bonus home so my little sister could have the education I never got. My mother never mentioned that. She simply handed Sarah the check like it materialized from thin air. I stood in the corner of that suffocating room, completely ignored, clutching a piece of paper that meant nothing to them, and I realized then that in this house, my achievements were only valuable if they could be cashed in to fund Sarah's comfortable, entitled life. I folded the commendation letter perfectly in half, slid it into my breast pocket, and erased all emotion from my face. The suffocating scent of cheap vanilla candles and the clinking of beer bottles filled the room, and not a single person looked in my direction. My father sat in his recliner with the television remote glued to his palm, flipping between football games, grunting at the screen. He had not even stood up when I walked through the door in my dress uniform. He had not asked about boot camp, about the blisters on my feet, about the nights I spent lying awake on a steel rack, wondering if I had made the right decision. To him, I was background noise, a reliable source of monthly checks and absolutely nothing more. A few years later, Sarah brought Matthew home for the first time. He was a rookie local cop swaggering through the front door as if he had just conquered a foreign nation. He deliberately unclipped his heavy utility belt and tossed his shiny silver badge onto the kitchen counter, letting the metal clang loudly against the granite to ensure every single person in the room looked at it. My parents fawned over him, instantly pouring him premium drinks and treating him like a decorated war hero. I sat quietly at the dining table, my posture rigid and my eyes observant. He did not carry himself with the quiet discipline of a true law enforcement officer. He carried himself with a bloated, fragile ego demanding free beers and constant, pathetic validation from my father. He noticed me watching him from the corner of the room, and his arrogant smile faltered for a split second under my cold, analytical gaze. To compensate for his sudden wave of insecurity, he marched over to Sarah, draped a heavy arm over her shoulder, and kissed her loudly, projecting a fake, aggressive dominance to mask his utter lack of substance. As the evening dragged on and the alcohol flowed, Matthew's deep-seated insecurities bled through his fake confidence. He took a long, sloppy pull from his beer bottle, his eyes darting toward my perfectly pressed military uniform. He knew deep down that he lacked the physical stamina and mental fortitude to survive even 1 week of federal military training. To soothe his bruised ego, he wiped the foam from his upper lip, leaned heavily against the kitchen island, and smirked. "Military logistics is just glorified warehouse work, right?" he announced loudly to the room, desperate for an audience. Sarah let out a sharp hyena-like laugh, leaning into his shoulder and pointing an acrylic nail at me. "You're just trying to show off, Janet." She sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "You'll never fit in with normal people." My mother simply nodded in agreement from the sink, washing dishes in dead silence. The betrayal stung like a physical slap, but my military training immediately kicked in. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with civilians. I clamped my jaw shut, resting my hands flat on the table, and stared dead into Matthew's eyes until he shifted uncomfortably, broke eye contact, and nervously took another sip of his beer. I refused to give them the explosive emotional reaction they were actively fishing for. Without a single word, I stood up from the dining table, pushing my heavy oak chair back with a sharp, definitive scrape that echoed across the hardwood floor. I walked down the narrow hallway, my eyes briefly scanning the family portraits on the wall, where I was always conveniently placed in the back shadows. I walked into the guest room, grabbed my olive drab canvas duffel bag, and hoisted the heavy straps onto my shoulder. My real family wore combat boots, carried rifles, and bled for one another in the desert dirt. They did not sit in suburban kitchens drinking cheap beer and tearing each other down for sport. I walked straight past the living room, completely ignoring Matthew's confused stare and Sarah's theatrical eye roll without offering a single goodbye. I grasped the cold brass doorknob, twisted it sharply, and stepped out into the freezing night air. The frost crunched loudly beneath my combat boots as I walked to my car. I slid behind the wheel, slammed the heavy door shut, and pulled away from that house, severing my emotional dependence on their approval once and for all. A decade passed in a grueling blur of overseas combat deployments and high-stakes strategic command rooms. I earned the rank of colonel through absolute unwavering discipline, leading thousands of Marines in high-stress logistics operations across 3 continents. I did not sleep, I did not complain, and I certainly did not beg for promotions. When I finally came home for a brief mandatory holiday leave, the stark contrast between my world and theirs was suffocating. I walked into their sterile dining room, unbuttoned my dress jacket, and laid my cover on the table. The heavy metallic silver eagles pinned to the fabric shone brilliantly under the cheap overhead chandelier lights. Matthew stood frozen in the doorway, staring intently at those eagles, his face turning a furious, mottled shade of red. He knew exactly what that rank meant in the federal hierarchy. He knew the sheer amount of federal authority, budget control, and lethal responsibility I wielded on a daily basis, and it absolutely terrified him. He crossed his arms tightly across his chest, his knuckles turning white, refusing to offer a single word of congratulations to the highest-ranking officer in the room. Sarah sat next to him, scrolling through her phone, completely uninterested in the career milestone I had achieved through blood, sweat, and years of sleeping on military cots in hostile territory. My mother busied herself setting the table, arranging forks and knives with exaggerated care, as if the silverware placement was somehow more significant than her eldest daughter's promotion to the highest field-grade rank in the Marine Corps. Not one person in that room said congratulations. Not one person asked what I had endured to earn those silver eagles. The silence was deafening, and it told me everything I needed to know about the worth they assigned to my existence. Matthew, on the other hand, had been hopelessly stuck at the rank of sergeant for over a decade. I noticed the stack of lieutenant exam study guides shoved behind the couch cushions, still wrapped in their original plastic gathering, a thick layer of dust. He lacked the discipline to crack them open, preferring to spend his evenings drinking at local sports bars and flashing his badge to get free meals. That particular evening, he sat heavily on my parents' sagging couch, a half-empty bottle of domestic beer dangling loosely from his thick fingers. He jabbed a remote at the television, flipping between channels without landing on anything, his mouth running on autopilot. "The whole system is rigged," he slurred, gesturing vaguely at the ceiling. "Those captains play favorites. You gotta know somebody to get ahead. He blamed the union, blamed his shift commander, blamed the entire state government for his stagnation. I sat across from him in the living room, with perfect military posture, silently analyzing the profound depths of his failures. A pile of unpaid parking tickets sat on the coffee table next to a greasy pizza box. His patrol boots were scuffed and unpolished, tossed carelessly by the front door. The television remote had worn grooves from his thumb. This was a man who had surrendered to mediocrity and decorated the surrender with excuses. He noticed my absolute silence and hated me for it. My very existence as a highly successful self-made female commander was a walking, breathing insult to his fragile masculinity. Every time I adjusted my uniform or checked my government-issued phone, I could see the bitter resentment boiling in his eyes, desperate for a way to drag me down to his level. Unable to handle the suffocating weight of his own inadequacy, Matthew finally lashed out during dinner. He leaned his heavy frame aggressively across the table, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. He jabbed a silver fork in my direction, his voice dripping with defensive venom. "Don't think those silver birds make you better than a real street cop." He spat, chewing his food loudly. "I face real danger on these streets every single night. You just sit behind a desk pushing papers for the government." He desperately tried to gaslight me into feeling small, attempting to drag my federal military command down to the pathetic level of his local traffic stops and domestic dispute calls. The entire table fell dead silent, waiting for me to snap. Instead of yelling, I slowly picked up a pristine white napkin. I wiped my mouth with deliberate, agonizing precision. I locked my eyes onto his, staring straight through his bravado like he was a pane of glass, refusing to flinch or break eye contact for even a second. Sarah giggled nervously beside him, her fingers fidgeting with the stem of her wine glass, desperate to break the unbearable silence I had weaponized against her husband. I completely refused to argue with a subordinate mind. A Marine Corps colonel does not engage in petty emotional squabbles with a disgruntled local sergeant throwing a temper tantrum over mashed potatoes. I stood up smoothly, my uniform remaining completely immaculate, and picked up my cover from the table. I adjusted it perfectly under my left arm. Sarah immediately started to open her mouth, preparing to loudly defend her husband's blatant disrespect. But I raised one hand palm facing her, silencing her instantly with a single authoritative gesture. I turned on my heel, the sharp sound of my polished shoes echoing in the silent room. I left him arguing with empty air, his fragile ego shattering against my absolute chilling indifference. I walked out the front door, slid behind the wheel of my government SUV, and shifted into gear. The powerful hum of the engine vibrated through the floorboards as I drove away from their suffocating mediocrity, leaving them to drown in their own bitterness. 3 months ago, during a tense Thanksgiving dinner, the psychological warfare escalated from verbal jabs to outright physical intimidation. I arrived at their house strictly out of pure obligation to our aging, frail mother, fully intending to eat quietly and leave before the second bottle of wine was uncorked. Matthew had been drinking cheap whiskey since noon, his face flushed and his movements erratic. The nauseating sweetness of baked ham mixed with the bitter stench of cheap whiskey saturated every corner of the cramped, overheated kitchen. He cornered me near the counter as I was pouring a glass of water from the tap. Without warning, he deliberately bumped his heavy shoulder violently into mine as he walked past the force, knocking my glass against the granite countertop with a sharp crack. His breath was hot with whiskey. It was a calculated physical test. He desperately wanted a reaction. He wanted me to break my ingrained military bearing, drop my glass, and shout like a common street brawler, just so he could play the victim and call me unhinged in front of the family. I did not spill a single drop. I took a tactical half-step back, creating a safe reactionary distance, my hands resting loosely at my sides, fully prepared to deflect another violent shove if he was stupid enough to try it. The glass sat on the countertop, a thin crack running down its side, and I left it there like evidence at a crime scene. Hearing the commotion, Sarah rushed into the kitchen, drawn by the thick tension in the air. But she did not come to scold her drunk husband for initiating physical contact. She came to point a sharp, acrylic-tipped finger directly at my chest. She instantly weaponized my presence, aggressively protecting the aggressor while relentlessly attacking the target. She stepped between me and Matthew, her back turned to him, her eyes burning with irrational hatred as they locked onto mine. She leaned in close and lowered her voice into a vicious, theatrical whisper. "If you ruin this dinner by disrespecting my husband, you are dead to me." She hissed, her breath smelling of red wine. She was entirely willing to sacrifice her own biological sister, ignoring the blatant assault just to coddle the bloated ego of a mediocre man. She knew our frail mother was sitting just a few feet away in the living room, her thin hands folded in her lap, completely unaware of the venom being spat in the kitchen. Sarah used her as a hostage to force my total compliance. I stared at her pointing finger coldly, calculating the exact level of psychological delusion required to make that statement with a straight face. Matthew smirked from safely behind her shoulder, hiding like a coward behind his wife's protective skirt. His bravado was entirely fueled by alcohol and the safety of his own kitchen. He knew full well he could not intimidate me physically in a fair fight, and he knew he could not challenge me professionally, so he used Sarah as his human shield to launch his attacks. He poured himself another glass of dark whiskey, raising the crystal tumbler in a mocking, highly exaggerated toast to my cushy federal desk job. It was the pathetic display of a small man who needed his wife to fight his battles against another woman. I stood my ground, evaluating his weak, slightly swaying stance. I noted his terrible balance, and the desperate, pathetic need for attention swirling in his bloodshot eyes. I knew I could dismantle him physically and professionally in less than 10 seconds, but I actively chose not to give him the war he was begging for. Not yet. Not on his terms. Not in front of an 80-year-old woman eating pumpkin pie in the next room who had no idea her son-in-law was chest-bumping a federal officer in her kitchen. Matthew's bravery had a very specific address. It only showed up within the walls of his own house, backed by his wife screaming and a belly full of cheap liquor. I filed that observation away like an intelligence briefing, knowing the day would come when he would be stupid enough to try this performance outside these walls where the consequences would be real and permanent. I looked past his smirking face, catching a brief glimpse of my frail mother sitting quietly in the living room armchair, her thin blanket pulled over her knees, completely unaware of the battle being waged 20 feet away. For her sake, and her sake alone, I forced my tense muscles to relax. I employed standard combat breathing to lower my spiking heart rate, inhaling sharply for 4 seconds, holding it steady for 4, and exhaling for 4. I swallowed the righteous, burning rage in my chest and stayed completely silent, allowing them a hollow, pathetic victory. Without uttering a single word in my defense, I turned my back on both of them and retreated to the back porch. The freezing November air hit my face like a physical blow. I gripped the icy wooden railing of the deck until the splinters bit into my skin and my knuckles turned stark white. I could still hear Matthew's muffled laughter through the kitchen window, celebrating his perceived conquest over a woman who outranked him in every measurable dimension of human achievement. As I stared out into the dark yard, I made a silent, unbreakable vow. I would never let these people humiliate me again. The countdown to their complete and utter destruction had officially begun. That brings us to tonight. Just a few hours before the flashing police lights filled my mirrors and shattered our family forever, I was sitting at their dining table. I used heavy silver serving tongs to carefully place a thick cut of roast onto Matthew's plate, fulfilling the basic polite duties of a guest in their home. The atmosphere in the room was thick with unspoken resentment and bitter envy. Matthew shoved the meat aggressively around his plate with his fork glaring darkly at my pristine uniform jacket draped over the back of my chair. He had not spoken a single word to me since I arrived. The sharp, aggressive clatter of silverware was the only sound in the dining room until Sarah slammed her heavy silver fork down onto her porcelain plate, the noise breaking through the oppressive silence like a gunshot. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest, fixing me with an entitled, demanding glare. She did not look at me like a sister. She looked at me like an ATM machine that was refusing to dispense cash. I kept my face entirely neutral, anticipating the inevitable psychological attack that was about to launch from across the table. Matthew needs a recommendation letter for the state task force. Sarah announced loudly, her voice piercing the quiet room. She was not asking for a favor. She was issuing a direct command to a superior officer. You have high-level connections at the federal level. Make a call, pull some strings, and get his application pushed to the top of the pile. Matthew sat back heavily in his wooden chair, crossing his arms and puffing out his chest. He fully expected me to blindly compromise my hard-earned military integrity just to feed his stagnant, pathetic career. They absolutely hated my success. They mocked my discipline, yet they shamelessly demanded to feast on the spoils of it. They wanted the prestige of my rank without shedding a single drop of the blood required to earn it. I did not immediately respond. I slowly placed my fork down onto the table, aligning it perfectly parallel to my knife, calculating the exact trajectory of the confrontation they were desperately trying to provoke. The roast sat untouched on my plate, the juices pooling against the white porcelain. Matthew's jaw was set in that arrogant, expectant clench I had seen 100 times before, the look of a man who believed he was owed something simply for existing in the same bloodline. He had never studied for a single promotional exam. He had never volunteered for a difficult assignment. He had never once put in the grueling, soul-crushing work required to advance in any career, let alone law enforcement. And now he sat across from me, demanding I hand him the keys to a position he could not spell on an application form. I stared directly at them, thoroughly disgusted by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of their demand. I kept my voice incredibly low and devoid of any emotion. I do not use my military rank to secure personal favors for anyone. He has to study, take the exams, and pass the board like every other officer in this state. I stated flatly, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation or debate. Sarah's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage, her carefully constructed victim facade crumbling instantly into dust. "You owe us this, Janet. We are family," she screamed, pounding her clenched fist onto the table so hard the water glasses rattled against the wood. Matthew's face flushed a deep, violent crimson, his fragile pride entirely shattered in front of his screaming wife. He had expected me to fold under her guilt-tripping to hand him a shortcut on a silver platter. My absolute, unwavering refusal struck him like a physical blow to the ego. He gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles went white, his jaw grinding so hard I could hear the enamel cracking from across the room. I refused to engage in a screaming match over a roast dinner. I picked up my cloth napkin and placed it on the table with calculated, agonizing slowness. I stood up from my chair, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my uniform trousers, projecting an aura of total, untouchable control. I grabbed my car keys from the kitchen counter, the metal jingling sharply in the silent house. I refused to spend another single second breathing the same toxic air as these parasites. I walked straight out of their house, pulling the heavy oak front door shut behind me with a definitive click. I marched down the driveway to my government-issued SUV, slid into the cold leather driver's seat, and slammed the heavy door shut. I shoved the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life, and I pulled away from the curb, mistakenly believing I had escaped their toxicity for the night. I had no idea that my refusal at that dinner table had just triggered a catastrophic, illegal chain of events that would unfold on a dark, empty highway within the hour. Behind me, through the kitchen window of their house, I could see the faint outline of Matthew pacing back and forth, his silhouette jerking with furious gestures, while Sarah screamed at him from the dining chair. He grabbed his patrol jacket from the coat hook by the door and shoved his arms through the sleeves. He was reaching for his car keys before I even pulled out of their neighborhood. The humiliation of my refusal, delivered calmly and without emotion in front of his own wife, had broken something inside his fragile mind. He was no longer thinking like a rational man. He was thinking like a wounded animal with a badge and a patrol car, and he was about to make the most catastrophic decision of his entire life. Just hours later, on a desolate, pitch-black stretch of the interstate heading back to the base, the strobing flash of red and blue police lights violently exploded in my rearview mirror. I immediately checked my digital speedometer. I was driving exactly at the posted speed limit, my hands resting perfectly at 10 and 2. I activated my turn signal and pulled over to the gravel shoulder with controlled automatic military precision. I shifted the heavy SUV into park, rolled down my window, and waited. Heavy, aggressive footsteps crunched against the gravel, rapidly approaching my vehicle. The officer deliberately bypassed the passenger side entirely, a blatant, arrogant violation of standard police safety protocol. He marched straight to my driver's side window. The glass rolled down, and a high-beam tactical flashlight was immediately shoved into my face, blinding me instantly. I squinted through the harsh glare, my eyes burning until the outline of the badge and the smug silhouette came into sharp focus. "Matthew, what the hell are you doing?" I demanded, my voice slicing sharply through the freezing night air. He stood there in full patrol uniform, his chest puffed out, his hand resting on his duty belt, acting as though I were a common criminal he had just caught fleeing a bank robbery. He leaned his heavy frame aggressively against my door, a vile, triumphant smirk twisting his lips into a grotesque display of raw, petty power. "There is no Matthew here, ma'am. You were swerving between lanes, no turn signals. You appear to be driving under the influence." He lied, effortlessly savoring every single syllable of his fabricated charge. He desperately wanted to see a colonel beg for mercy. He wanted to see me panic, to sweat, to plead for special treatment on the side of a dark road. I did not blink. I reached calmly into my breast pocket, pulled out my federal military ID, and held it up directly into the beam of his flashlight. "I did no such thing, and you know it," I stated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, freezing register. "I am a federal employee driving a government vehicle. I demand you conduct this according to legal standards and not use personal grudges or envy to settle scores here." I stared directly into the blinding light, refusing to look away or show an ounce of fear. The red and blue lights strobed rhythmically across the empty asphalt behind him, painting the frozen highway in a sickening, pulsating glow. He had expected tears. He had expected begging. He received neither. His face darkened instantly, his fragile ego snapping violently under my direct defiance. He realized his badge was not striking terror into my heart. He reached down and unclipped his heavy leather holster strap with a loud, deliberate snap, a highly calculated act of physical intimidation meant to remind me he carried a loaded weapon on his hip. He leaned closer, his hot breath fogging the cold glass of my window. "Your Marine Corps colonel title has no power on these streets. You are not above the law, and tonight, I am the law." He snarled, his voice trembling with years of suppressed rage and festering inadequacy. He stepped back from the door, pointing forcefully at the frozen asphalt beneath his boots. "Step out of the car, right now." He was deliberately pushing me into a dangerous corner, desperately attempting to bait me into a physical altercation or a charge of resisting a police officer so he could slap handcuffs on my wrists and parade me in front of the local booking camera. His hand trembled near his holster. Not from cold, from the adrenaline of a man who had finally found a stage small enough for his delusions of grandeur. I did not argue with a man holding a gun and a grudge. I quietly reached for my phone on the passenger seat, activated the video camera, and wedged it perfectly between the center console seats, ensuring the lens captured the entire humiliating scene through my windshield. I opened my heavy door and stepped out into the freezing wind, standing with terrifyingly perfect military posture, my spine straight as a steel rod, my shoulders squared, my chin level. He ordered me to walk a straight line on the shoulder. I executed his bogus field sobriety test, flawlessly placing one polished shoe in front of the other with robotic precision, while the dashcam of his cruiser recorded my every move. He barked orders like a drill instructor who had never attended drill school, telling me to touch my nose count backwards from 30, stand on one leg. I complied with every single command with the mechanical perfection of a Marine who had marched through sandstorms carrying 80 pounds of gear. My steps were perfect. My balance was impeccable. My eyes tracked his penlight without a single involuntary tremor. There was nothing wrong with me, and every second of footage proved it. He grew more agitated with each test I passed, his commands becoming louder, more desperate, more unhinged, because the dashcam was building an airtight case against him with every frame it captured. Frustrated, furious, and utterly humiliated by my emotionless compliance, he marched back to his patrol car. He begrudgingly wrote me an absurd, completely fabricated ticket for failing to maintain a lane, violently ripping the yellow paper from his citation pad. He shoved the ticket toward my chest. I took the ticket from his hand without uttering a single word. I shot him a death stare that promised absolute systematic hell, turned on my heel, and got back into my SUV. The door shut with a heavy thud. I sat in the cold silence, the fabricated citation resting on my passenger seat, and I pressed the stop button on my phone's recording. 3 minutes and 47 seconds of pure, undeniable evidence. I shifted into gear and pulled back onto the empty highway, sealing his catastrophic fate with every mile I drove toward the base. The very next morning at the local police precinct, Matthew stood by the humming coffee machine in the break room, loudly boasting to anyone who would listen. He laughed hysterically, regaling the night shift officers with a heavily exaggerated story about how he forced his arrogant, high and mighty colonel sister-in-law to walk the white line in the freezing cold. He puffed out his chest, completely delusional, genuinely believing he had successfully asserted his absolute dominance over the United States military. He took a long sip of his coffee, soaking in what he foolishly assumed was the admiration of his peers. Half the break room stared at the floor. The other half exchanged nervous glances above their styrofoam cups. He had no idea that every word he spoke was digging his professional grave deeper, proving his actions were premeditated, retaliatory, and entirely driven by personal malice rather than actual law enforcement duties. One senior detective quietly excused himself from the break room and walked directly to his desk, where he typed a short, detailed email to the shift supervisor, documenting exactly what Matthew had just confessed to in front of a dozen witnesses. That email would later appear as Exhibit D in my civil case. Matthew, oblivious to the damage he was inflicting on himself, leaned against the counter and crossed his ankle over his boot, grinning like a man who had just won the lottery. In reality, he had just signed his own termination papers. Deputy Kevin Foster, a sharp, highly observant young officer who actually respected the federal chain of command, stopped dead in his tracks in the middle of the hallway. The color drained from his face as Matthew's boasting reached his ears. Kevin walked briskly up to Matthew, grabbing his elbow and pulling him to the corner of the break room, away from the cluster of officers pretending not to listen. "Are you insane? Do you know who you just messed with? A Marine Corps colonel is no joke. They manage an entire massive system. Her record is absolutely flawless. You're playing with fire." Kevin warned, keeping his voice low, his eyes wide with secondhand panic. He desperately tried to inject some reality into Matthew's delusion, explaining that a federal officer driving a government vehicle fell under jurisdictional protections that a local sergeant had absolutely no authority to override. But Matthew just waved his hand dismissively, rolling his eyes at the younger cop. He was completely blinded by his own stupidity, thoroughly convinced that I would stay silent and swallow the abuse just to protect the sacred family name. He believed the bloodline would shield him from the consequences of the badge. Kevin stepped back, shaking his head slowly, the look on his face carrying the unmistakable expression of a man watching someone walk willingly into a minefield. At that exact moment, across town, in my heavily fortified command office on the base, I sat rigidly behind my massive mahogany desk. Captain Michael Brooks, my most trusted and ruthlessly efficient aide, stood by the widescreen monitor mounted on the wall. He had just finished watching the hidden cell phone footage I had secured from the traffic stop, cross-referencing it frame by frame with the GPS telemetry data downloaded directly from my government vehicle's tracking system. The GPS proved conclusively that I had not swerved once. My speed had remained constant. My lane position had been perfect for the entire drive. Brooks pulled up Matthew's professional record on a second screen, and the pattern of abuse was staggering. 3 prior civilian complaints for aggressive behavior during routine traffic stops, all mysteriously buried by union representatives. 2 formal reprimands for excessive force that had been quietly expunged from his public file. Brooks looked up from the screen, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his cheeks jumped. He was vibrating with pure anger, deeply offended on behalf of the uniform we both wore. "Colonel, this is beyond outrageous, a blatant abuse of power. What is our next move?" he asked sharply, immediately snapping to parade rest and waiting for the order to strike. He did not see a family dispute. He saw an attack on a superior officer that demanded an overwhelming tactical response. I did not blink. I pulled a crisp, blank internal affairs complaint form from my top drawer and laid it flat on the desk. I uncapped my heavy gold fountain pen, the metal catching the cold, fluorescent light. "Gather all the evidence. We are sending this file straight to the police department's internal affairs, and simultaneously, I am filing a civil lawsuit. There are 0 exceptions here, even for family." I ordered, my voice as cold and flat as the steel barrel of a rifle. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with a heavy, aggressive, decisive stroke, the harsh scratching of the nib against the official form filling the silent office. I sealed his absolute doom with black ink. I slid the thick stack of paperwork across the polished mahogany desk to Captain Brooks. He collected it without a word, turned sharply on his heel, and marched towards the door. I was no longer a sister-in-law dealing with a domestic nuisance. I was a commanding officer executing a flawless, unstoppable tactical legal strike aimed directly at his career, his badge, and his entire fraudulent existence. If you agree that nobody should get a free pass for abuse just because they share your blood, hit that like button right now. Tell me in the comments if you have ever had to take drastic legal or personal action against a toxic relative. By the end of that same week, the massive legal storm I had carefully orchestrated made landfall at the local precinct with devastating force. Chief David Palmer stood behind his cluttered desk, his face draining of all color, turning a sickly shade of ashen gray as he read the federal civil lawsuit and the formal mandate from Internal Affairs delivered to his office by a special courier. He slammed his heavy fist onto his desk, violently knocking over his coffee mug and sending dark liquid spilling across his paperwork and pooling around the framed photograph of his wife. He realized in a split second that Matthew had dragged his entire department into a catastrophic, highly publicized jurisdictional nightmare by illegally detaining a high-ranking military officer driving a clearly marked government vehicle. Palmer was a pragmatic political animal who valued his department's pristine public reputation far above the career of a mediocre, reckless patrolman. He was absolutely not about to go down in flames or face a federal probe to protect a rogue sergeant with a bruised ego and a history of buried complaints. Palmer picked up his desk phone and dialed the city attorney's office. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. When he hung up, he loosened his tie, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and muttered something unprintable under his breath. The city attorney had been crystal clear. Settle fast, cut the officer loose, and pray the colonel does not escalate this to a federal civil rights investigation that would open every personnel file in the department to outside scrutiny. Palmer immediately called Matthew into his office. The moment Matthew stepped inside, still wearing that oblivious smirk, Palmer violently locked the heavy door behind him and hurled the thick, terrifying legal subpoena straight into Matthew's chest. The heavy packet bounced off his sternum and fell to the cold linoleum floor with a definitive, sickening thud. Palmer ruthlessly stripped Matthew of his fake authority, screaming at him until he was red in the face, cursing his sheer idiocy for provoking the United States military over a petty personal vendetta at a family dinner table. Without hesitation, Palmer demanded Matthew hand over his service sidearm. He held out his hand, palm up, fingers curled. Matthew fumbled with trembling fingers, unholstering the weapon and placing it on the desk. Palmer then demanded the badge. Matthew's hand shook as he unclipped the silver shield from his belt and laid it next to the gun. Palmer swept both items into his desk drawer and slammed it shut. Matthew stood there trembling uncontrollably, his face drained of all color, the sweat pouring down his neck and soaking the collar of his uniform. He stared blankly at his empty hands, the terrifying realization finally crashing down upon him like a concrete wall. His shiny little badge could not protect him from a massive federal lawsuit. The absolute street power he constantly bragged about had evaporated into thin air in mere seconds. That night, the silence of my quarters was shattered when my personal cell phone buzzed aggressively on my nightstand. I reached over and checked the screen. It was Sarah. I answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear, and was immediately met with hysterical, high-pitched sobbing. It was a highly calculated performance, perfectly rehearsed, meant to break my resolve and force my total submission through guilt and shame. "Are you crazy, Janet? Why are you suing my husband? Do you want to tear this family apart? You're always so rigid, always throwing your weight around. Drop the lawsuit right now and save Matthew's career." She shrieked through the speaker, her voice cracking with sheer entitlement and barely controlled fury. She desperately tried to use our parents' failing health and the sacred concept of family loyalty as a blunt weapon to bludgeon me into withdrawing the case. She painted herself as the victim, the innocent wife caught in the crossfire, the peacekeeper being destroyed by her own heartless sister. She completely ignored the fact that her husband had unclipped his holster, drawn a fabricated charge, and illegally detained me on a public highway. To her, the only crime committed that night was my refusal to let him get away with it. I listened to her theatrical cries and manipulative accusations without feeling a single ounce of pity. My fingers rested calmly on the edge of the nightstand. I let her scream until her voice cracked and the sobs dissolved into ragged breathing. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I spoke with absolute, terrifying military calm, my voice devoid of any sisterly affection, devoid of any warmth, devoid of anything but the cold, hard truth. I am not tearing this family apart, Sarah. He shredded our family ties the moment he flipped on those flashing red lights and forced me out of my car in the dead of night. At that moment, he didn't see me as his sister-in-law. He saw me as a target to satisfy his envy. There is no family here. This is the law. I did not wait for her counter-argument. I did not wait for her tears. I did not wait for the next wave of guilt designed to drown me. I firmly pressed the red button to end the call, dropping the phone face down onto my nightstand. The silence that followed was not lonely. It was not empty. It was the sound of absolute liberation. I turned off the lamp, pulled the crisp white sheets up to my chest, and closed my eyes. I slept soundly that night for the first time in decades. The morning of the trial, the county courthouse was swarming with local reporters and news cameras who had aggressively caught wind of the scandalous lawsuit. The story had leaked to a regional news affiliate 3 days prior, and the headline alone was enough to fill every seat in the gallery. A local police sergeant accused of using his badge to illegally detain and humiliate his own sister-in-law, a decorated Marine Corps colonel. I walked through the heavy oak double doors wearing my immaculate full Marine Corps dress uniform. The highly polished brass buttons gleamed under the fluorescent courthouse lights, and the rows of heavy ribbons and combat medals shone brilliantly on my chest, loudly announcing the decades of sacrifice I had made for my country. Sarah was sitting on the wooden hallway bench outside the courtroom, her eyes red and puffy, clutching a crumpled tissue in her fist. She glared at me with pure, unadulterated venom as I passed. I walked straight past her, my posture perfectly rigid, treating her exactly like a stranger on the street, my polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. Inside the courtroom, my attorney, Jessica Morgan, stood confidently by the plaintiff's table, arranging her thick legal files with surgical precision. She looked up and gave me a sharp, ready nod. We were not here to negotiate a peaceful settlement. We were not here to accept an apology. We were here to execute a total, devastating legal victory. As the proceedings began, defense attorney Robert Hayes scrambled desperately to save his client's rapidly sinking ship. He waved his hands theatrically, desperately, trying to convince the stern-faced judge that this entire ordeal was merely a trivial, family misunderstanding, a slight, forgivable overreaction by a dedicated officer who was deeply concerned for his sister-in-law's safety on a dark highway. He tried to paint me as the aggressive, uncooperative military brute who had escalated a routine traffic encounter into a federal incident. Matthew sat beside him at the defense table, sweating profusely through a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit, looking utterly pathetic and incredibly small. His hands trembled on the wooden surface. He kept his eyes glued to the defense table. His fingers interlocked so tightly his knuckles had gone completely white, completely stripped of the arrogant, chest-puffing swagger he had possessed on the highway. A half-empty water glass sat in front of him, and even from the plaintiff's table I could see the surface of the water trembling from the vibration of his shaking hands. He was terrified of the judge, terrified of the media cameras pointed at the back of his skull, and most of all, terrified to look directly at the uniform I was wearing. The rows of medals on my chest were a physical reminder of everything he had failed to become, and they stared at him from across the aisle like the eyes of a jury that had already reached its verdict. Hayes's flimsy defense shattered the moment my hidden phone video was played on the massive courtroom monitor, perfectly synced with the police dashcam footage we had subpoenaed from the department. The entire courtroom watched his smirking face and heard his illegal, ego-driven commands broadcast loudly through the speakers. They heard him fabricate a drunk driving accusation against a woman who walked a perfect line. They heard the arrogance. They heard the malice. They heard the envy dripping from every syllable. I took the witness stand, the heavy clank of my medals echoing in the dead silent room as I settled into the wooden chair. I locked my eyes onto Matthew sitting at the defense table, his face the color of wet cement. My voice projected with the authority of a commanding officer addressing a formation. When he turned on his flashing lights wearing that uniform and approached my vehicle with his hand resting on his holster, he was not my brother-in-law. He was a representative of the law, and he abused that sacred power to satisfy his petty personal envy. If he could do this to a family member, a senior military officer, what would he do to a vulnerable civilian? The words landed like mortar rounds in the silent courtroom. A reporter in the gallery scribbled furiously. A juror in the front row closed her eyes and shook her head slowly. Matthew's attorney gripped his pen so tightly it snapped in half. Jessica Morgan moved in for the kill. She hammered Matthew relentlessly on cross-examination, expertly poking at his deep-seated insecurities and professional failures, until his extremely fragile ego shattered entirely under the crushing pressure of the courtroom. She asked him why he had bypassed standard approach protocol. She asked him why the GPS data showed 0 lane deviation. She asked him why 3 prior civilian complaints had been buried from his file. She asked him about the whiskey he had consumed that afternoon, before putting on his badge and climbing into a patrol car to pursue a family member. Unable to control his temper, unable to sit still under the weight of his own exposed lies, Matthew violently slammed his hands onto the defense table, the wood cracking under the force. He shot to his feet, screaming at the top of his lungs, his face a twisted mask of uncontrollable rage. "I just wanted to teach her a lesson. She's always so arrogant with that military title." The entire courtroom erupted in loud, shocked gasps. His own attorney dropped his head into his hands. Matthew had just fully confessed to intentional abuse of power under oath, confirming every single allegation in my lawsuit with his own screaming mouth. Judge Wright's face turned furious. He immediately slammed his heavy wooden gavel 3 times aggressively, silencing the room, the sound echoing off the marble walls like cannon fire. He ordered Matthew to pay $50,000 in personal damages and officially recommended the permanent revocation of his police badge and certification. I stood up from the witness stand, adjusting my uniform jacket with 2 precise tugs, and walked back to the plaintiff's table. I sat down, folded my hands on the smooth wood surface, and allowed myself a single controlled exhale. Victorious. The fallout from the trial was swift, absolute, and completely unforgiving. Matthew was officially fired from the police department the very next week. Chief Palmer held a closed-door meeting with the city council and made the decision in under 15 minutes. Matthew's badge was permanently stripped, his service weapon confiscated, and his professional reputation completely annihilated by the evening news cycle that ran his courtroom outburst on a continuous loop. He was officially blacklisted from ever working for any law enforcement agency in the state. Again, his name added to a decertification registry that would follow him for the rest of his natural life. Without his income and burdened by the crushing weight of the $50,000 judgment and exorbitant legal fees that his desperate attorney could not reduce, Sarah's household quickly fell into deep financial chaos. The mortgage payments stopped. The credit cards maxed out. The arguments bled through the walls of their suburban house every single night, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, loud enough for the neighbors to stop waving when Sarah walked to her mailbox. They reaped exactly the poisonous harvest they had spent decades sowing. I did not celebrate their horrific downfall, nor did I reach out to offer a single dime of financial assistance. I sat at my desk on base, pulled out my phone, opened my contacts, scrolled to Sarah's name and pressed delete. I scrolled to Matthew's name and pressed delete. I scrolled to my parents' landline and held my thumb over the screen for 3 full seconds before pressing delete. I set the phone face down on the desk and I closed that toxic, draining chapter of my life, forever, feeling a profound sense of lightness settle into my bones for the first time in 45 years. I returned to my command at the military base the following Monday, walking purposefully onto the vast paved grinder as the brilliant morning sun crested over the massive concrete barracks. The formation was already assembled. Rows upon rows of perfectly aligned Marines stood at parade rest, their boots polished, their covers straight, their eyes forward. I walked the line, inspecting uniforms. I stopped in front of a young lance corporal whose collar brass was a 1/4 inch off center. I reached forward and adjusted it with 2 fingers, tapping the pin into place. He did not flinch. He did not cower. He stood taller. I gave him a curt nod and moved on. This was my true sanctuary, a world built on merit, sacrifice, and unbreakable trust. These men and women valued honor over ego. They bled for each other in combat without ever demanding a twisted, manipulative favor in return. They did not gaslight. They did not guilt trip. They did not weaponize love to extract obedience. They earned their rank through blood and discipline, and they respected mine because they understood the weight of it. I climbed the metal stairs to the elevated wooden podium, my boots ringing against each step, and I turned to face the formation. An endless sea of crisp uniforms stared back at me, perfectly still, perfectly silent. I looked at the hundreds of young, eager Marines standing before me, ready to absorb my command and follow me into whatever mission awaited them. I gripped the edges of the heavy wooden podium, feeling the rough grain under my palms. I thought about Matthew's smirk on the highway, the flashlight blinding my eyes, the fabricated ticket shoved into my chest. I thought about Sarah's finger pointed at my sternum in the kitchen, her whispered threat delivered over the stench of cheap whiskey and baked ham. I thought about my mother handing Sarah a check paid for with my boot camp blood, without ever looking in my direction. I thought about the commendation letter I folded into my breast pocket at 19 years old, the one nobody in that house ever acknowledged. I adjusted the heavy microphone on the podium, ensuring my voice would carry across the vast expanse of asphalt, and I spoke. Not as their commanding officer giving a routine morning briefing. As a survivor who had navigated the worst betrayal of trust imaginable and come out the other side, still standing, still serving, still breathing. The entire base fell dead silent as I began. Many believe that loyalty to family is absolute. But let me tell you this. No loyalty, not even blood ties, is allowed to rank above the integrity and discipline of someone wearing a uniform. Power was not created to indulge a fragile ego nor to bully others. When you compromise with wrongdoing due to personal grudges or blind affection, you don't just betray the uniform you wear, you betray your own conscience. The words hung heavily in the crisp morning air, striking the core of every Marine standing before me. I could see it in their faces, the young ones who still wrote letters home to complicated families. The senior NCOs who had swallowed similar poisons from their own blood relatives. The officers who had faced the impossible choice between loyalty and integrity and knew exactly which one I had chosen. I stepped back from the microphone, raised my hand, and delivered a sharp, perfectly executed salute. The entire formation returned it in perfect, thunderous unison, hundreds of hands rising and falling as one. The sound of their synchronized movement echoed off the barracks walls and rolled across the parade deck like a single heartbeat. I held my salute for 3 full seconds, looking out over the only family that had ever truly earned the right to call itself mine. I lowered my hand, turned sharply on my heel, and walked off the podium. The sun warmed the back of my neck. My boots struck the concrete in a steady, unbreakable rhythm. I had finally won my true freedom, and I had won it surrounded by the people who actually deserved it. If my refusal to back down inspired you to enforce your own boundaries, please like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment sharing the hardest lesson you have ever had to teach your family, because your strength might just save someone else today.